My name is Eliana Mercer, and 9-year-old segment producer who learned to measure her worth by how little space she was allowed to take inside her own family. My brother, Grant Mercer, was the golden child mom dressed in certainty, and dad defended like an investment, while I was the daughter trained to anticipate their moods, absorb their disappointments, and disappear before my needs became inconvenient. Mom called Grant our legacy, and Dad called him the one who carries our name forward. But when I worked double shifts, paid my own tuition, and quietly covered their overdue bills, they treated my effort like background noise instead of proof of value. And when my mother sat under studio lights and told a live audience, with a steady voice that never trembled, she was never ours. I tightened my grip around the sealed DNA report in my lap, and realized she had just forced me to end this story in front of everyone. The applause came too early, soft at first and then swelling in confused agreement because the audience thought they were witnessing a brave confession instead of a carefully staged erasure, and I sat there in a chair that felt too small for the moment, watching Mom cross one leg over the other as if she had rehearsed even the angle of her ankle. The host leaned forward with sympathetic curiosity, asking gentle questions that framed her as a woman finally choosing honesty, while the giant screen behind them displayed a close-up of her composed expression, every detail sharpened by light designed to flatter rather than reveal. Dad sat in the second row with his hands folded in that quiet, managerial posture he used whenever emotions needed to be contained into something presentable. And Grant, seated beside him, looked mildly uncomfortable in the way he always did when attention drifted away from him and toward something he could not immediately control. I could feel every camera in the room recalibrating toward me. Not because I had spoken yet, but because silence, when held long enough, becomes its own kind of spectacle. My fingers pressed against the edge of the envelope resting on my knees, the thick paper inside it heavier than it should have been, as if truth carried weight independent of gravity, and I found myself remembering the last time Mom had used that tone, the same measured calm, the same careful diction, the same refusal to let emotion disrupt the narrative she had already chosen. It had been years earlier at a school board meeting when a teacher questioned Grant's behavior. And Mom had stood there, smiling politely, explaining that some children are simply more sensitive to misunderstanding, while I stood 3 feet away holding a folder of incident reports no one asked to see. That memory settled into place with brutal precision, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed that nothing about this moment was new, only larger, brighter, and finally impossible to ignore. Mom was not revealing something for the first time. She was completing a pattern that had been forming for decades. A pattern where truth was shaped into something that protected Grant, elevated her, and left me just outside the boundary of belonging. The difference now was scale, because what had once happened in kitchens, hallways, and quiet offices was now unfolding in front of an audience trained to believe what they were shown. And for the first time in my life, I was not the only witness. The host turned to me then, her expression soft with practiced empathy, and asked how it felt to hear my mother describe our family that way, as if the question itself were generous, as if I had been invited there to process instead of respond. I could feel the old reflex rising in my chest, the instinct to soften, to explain, to translate my own experience into something that would make everyone else more comfortable. And for a fraction of a second, I almost let it happen, almost stepped back into the role I had played so well for so long. But something had shifted long before I walked onto that stage. Something that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with clarity. Because once you understand that you were never misinterpreted but deliberately rewritten, the desire to be understood loses its urgency. I lifted my eyes to meet Mom's, and for the first time, she did not look at me like a variable she could control, but like an outcome she had not fully calculated. Then I opened the envelope. The moment I slid the first sheet of paper onto the glass table, the energy in the studio tightened in a way that did not look dramatic from the outside, but felt unmistakably restrictive from where I sat, as if the room itself had decided to test whether I would continue or retreat. The host leaned in with a cautious smile that tried to preserve control over the segment, while Mom's posture remained composed but subtly angled toward me. Not in curiosity, but in quiet containment. the way she had always positioned herself whenever I approached something she did not want revealed. Dad did not speak, yet his presence behind the cameras carried a familiar weight, a silent directive that had shaped my entire childhood, telling me without words that escalation would not end in my favor. Grant shifted slightly in his seat, not out of concern, but out of discomfort at being pulled into a moment that did not revolve around him. I think we should be precise about what was just said, I began, keeping my tone measured, because I understood that the first person to sound unstable in a room like this loses before the truth is even considered. The host nodded, but there was hesitation in it now, a subtle recalibration, as if she were deciding how much space I would be allowed before the segment needed to be redirected. Mom exhaled softly and placed one hand over the other in her lap, a gesture so controlled it almost looked gentle. Yet I recognized it instantly as preparation, not patience. "Eliana," she said, her voice warm enough to pass as concern but structured enough to redirect the room. "This is not the place to unpack something you clearly don't fully understand, and I would really prefer if we kept this focused on healing instead of confusion." The audience responded to her tone more than her words, because she sounded reasonable, grounded, protective, and I could feel attention beginning to tilt toward her, the narrative subtly reshaping itself around the idea that I was about to complicate something that should remain simple. The host followed her lead almost instinctively, turning back to me with a softer voice that carried a quiet warning beneath it. "Maybe we can take a step back and clarify what you're feeling before we move into documents," she suggested, framing my evidence as secondary to my emotions, as if the facts themselves required permission to exist in this space. That framing pressed against me harder than any direct accusation, because it echoed the exact language I had been raised under, the idea that my perception was always negotiable while theirs was definitive. I placed my hand flat on the paper, not revealing it yet, and felt the edge of doubt attempt to re-enter my thinking. Not because I questioned the truth, but because I had been conditioned for years to question the timing of truth, the tone of truth, the appropriateness of truth. Mom leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice just enough to suggest intimacy while ensuring the microphone still carried every word, and said, "You don't have to do this here. We can talk about it privately like a family." Which would have sounded like care to anyone who did not understand that privately in our house had always meant without witnesses. Dad finally spoke then, his voice steady, controlled, and unmistakably authoritative, cutting across the space without raising in volume. "This is not how you handle something like this," he said, not looking at me directly, but addressing the situation as if I were a problem to be managed rather than a person to be heard, and that single sentence landed with the full weight of every correction he had ever delivered to me growing up. It was not loud. It did not need to be. For a brief moment, the room aligned against me in a way that felt painfully familiar. The host waiting for me to soften, the audience unsure but leaning toward the calmer voice. My parents positioned as stability while I stood at the edge of disruption, and I could feel the old instinct rising again. The one that told me survival depended on stepping back, apologizing, making the moment smaller so everyone else could remain comfortable. That instinct had kept me safe for years, but it had never kept me seen. "I understand why you want this to stay private," I said slowly, choosing each word with deliberate control. "Because private is where this has always lived, and private is how it has always been managed." My voice did not rise, yet something in the room shifted again, because calm, when it refuses to yield, becomes harder to dismiss than anger. Mom's expression tightened for the first time, not dramatically, but enough that the softness she had been presenting began to fracture at the edges. "We are trying to protect you," she said, this time with less warmth and more insistence, the phrase landing heavier because it had been used so many times before to justify decisions I was never allowed to question. "You are taking something complicated and turning it into something harmful, and I will not let you damage this family for the sake of a misunderstanding." The word misunderstanding settled into the space between us, like a final attempt to close the door. And for one suspended second, I felt exactly what they expected me to feel. Small. The word settled into me with a familiar weight. But instead of folding under it the way I had been trained to do, I felt something far quieter and far more decisive take its place. Because there is a point where repetition stops shaping you and starts revealing the pattern you were never meant to see. The cameras were still fixed on my face, the audience suspended between curiosity and judgment, and my parents positioned exactly as they had always been, presenting unity, reason, and authority while waiting for me to either retreat or fracture under the pressure they had carefully rebuilt around me. For a brief second, I could almost see the version of myself they expected. The one who would lower her eyes, soften her voice, and translate her own experience into something easier for them to absorb. And recognizing that version felt like watching a ghost of a life I was no longer willing to continue. "I'm not confused," I said, my voice steady in a way that did not ask for permission. And I let the sentence extend just enough to anchor what came next without rushing into it. The host did not interrupt this time, but her posture changed slightly, the careful neutrality shifting into something more alert, because she could sense that the direction of the segment was no longer something she could easily guide back into a safe conclusion. Mom remained still, but her eyes sharpened with the kind of focus she reserved for moments when control was beginning to slip. And Dad's silence behind the cameras grew heavier, no longer neutral but watchful, as if recalculating outcomes in real time. "I spent the last 6 weeks verifying every detail before I agreed to be here," I continued, placing the second document on top of the first, aligning them with quiet precision, because I knew that if I spoke without evidence, it would be dismissed as interpretation, and if I spoke with evidence, it would be called inappropriate timing. The audience shifted again, a low ripple of attention moving through the room, because certainty, when expressed without aggression, carries its own authority. "So I didn't come here to argue with you," I added, my gaze fixed on Mom now. "I came here because you chose to tell this story publicly, and that means the truth no longer belongs in private." That sentence did not raise my voice, but it changed the space between us. And for the first time, Mom did not immediately respond. The host leaned forward, her tone now carefully balanced between concern and interest. "What truth are you referring to?" she asked. And this time there was no attempt to redirect me away from the documents, because the momentum of the moment had already moved past containment. I slid the top page forward, turning it so it faced the camera, the printed letterhead and signature lines clearly visible under the studio lights, and I could feel my heartbeat slow instead of accelerate, which surprised me, because I had expected fear, not clarity. "This report confirms that I am biologically related to one of my parents," I said, keeping my phrasing exact. "But not in the way that has been presented here today." A murmur spread more distinctly through the audience now, no longer uncertain but engaged, because contradiction creates tension faster than explanation can resolve it, and people instinctively lean toward tension. The host's eyes dropped to the document and then lifted again, sharper, more focused, as she began to understand that this was no longer a story about feelings but about facts. Mom exhaled again, but this time the sound carried less control and more urgency, and she leaned slightly toward me, her voice lower, more direct, no longer shaped for the audience but aimed at me. "You don't know what you're doing," she said. And although the sentence was simple, it carried years of authority behind it. Years of correction. Years of being told that my understanding required supervision. "I know exactly what I'm doing," I replied, not quickly, not defensively, but with a steadiness that came from having already lived through the worst version of their reaction in my own mind before I ever stepped onto that stage. Dad shifted in his seat then, the first visible sign that the situation had moved beyond what he considered manageable, and his voice came from behind the cameras, controlled but firmer than before. "Eliana, stop," he said. And although it was only 2 words, it carried the full expectation of obedience that had defined my entire life. For a fraction of a second the room held its breath, because something in that command felt different now, not authoritative, but exposed. And in that pause, I understood something with a clarity that felt almost physical. "I didn't need their permission anymore. I found the affidavit in your study," I said, turning slightly so that my voice carried not just to Mom, but to the entire room. Because this was no longer a private conversation pretending to be public. This was a public truth refusing to be returned to silence. The one filed the week I was born. The one that describes an emergency custodial transfer that was never completed under standard adoption procedures. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they were louder, but because they were specific. And specificity removes the last place denial can hide. Mom's composure finally broke at the edges, not in a dramatic way, but in a tightening of her jaw, a slight delay before her next breath, the smallest fracture in the image she had constructed so carefully. That document is being taken out of context, she said quickly, the first sign of speed entering her voice, and speed for her was always a mistake. What context explains why my original records were sealed under a dispute? I asked, not raising my tone, but narrowing the space she had left herself to respond. She did not answer immediately, and in that silence, something shifted again, not just in me, but in the room. Because for the first time, it was not me being asked to explain. It was her. The host leaned forward, her voice now fully engaged, no longer cautious, no longer redirecting. "Can you clarify that?" she asked Mom, and the direction of the question marked a quiet but undeniable turning point, because control had moved, even if only slightly, away from where it had always been. Grant stood up halfway, as if unsure whether to intervene or disappear, his usual confidence replaced by something closer to confusion, because this was not a situation he had been prepared to dominate or deflect. Dad remained still, but his silence had changed again. No longer authoritative, but strained, as if recalculating a scenario that no longer followed his expectations. I reached into my bag then. Not hurriedly, not dramatically, but with the same deliberate motion I had practiced, and closed my fingers around something small, something I had carried with me for years without understanding why. When I placed the bracelet on the table, the metal catching the light just enough to make the engraved letter visible, I did not look at the audience. I looked at Mom. And this time, she didn't look composed. When the show ended and the studio lights dimmed, the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had been said on stage. Because exposure does not end when the cameras stop recording. It expands into every space you return to afterward. I walked out through a side exit instead of the main lobby. Not because anyone told me to, but because I could already feel the shift in how people looked at me. The mixture of curiosity, judgment, and distance that attaches itself to someone who has just disrupted a story the world was more comfortable believing. My phone began vibrating before I even reached the parking lot, messages stacking on top of each other from unknown numbers, fragments of reactions I had not asked for and could not control, and I understood in that moment that whatever I had uncovered did not just belong to my family anymore. It belonged to anyone willing to interpret it without context. By the time I reached my apartment, the version of my life that had existed that morning was already gone in ways I had not fully anticipated, because truth does not arrive cleanly, it drags consequences behind it. My supervisor called before I could take off my shoes, his voice careful, professional, explaining that the network needed time to assess the situation, and that it would be best if I took a leave of absence until things settled, which sounded temporary, but carried the quiet finality of decisions already made. I sat on the edge of my bed after the call ended, staring at the same wall I had looked at every night for 3 years, and realized that stability, the thing I had built piece by piece without anyone's help, could be taken away just as quickly as it had been earned. The first night alone was louder than I expected, not because of noise, but because of the absence of it, the kind of silence that leaves space for every thought you have been postponing. I opened my laptop out of habit, intending to work, to organize something, to prove to myself that I was still in control of at least one part of my life, but the screen reflected back a version of me that felt suspended between identities, no longer the daughter I had been defined as, and not yet anything else. The bracelet sat on my desk beside the documents I had carried onto that stage, and for the first time since I had found them, I did not feel clarity when I looked at them. I felt alone. The following weeks did not unfold with any sense of momentum or triumph, but with a slow, uneven rhythm that forced me to confront realities I had never prepared for. Because independence is not a single decision, it is a series of small, often uncomfortable adjustments that accumulate into something you either survive or retreat from. Rent was due whether or not my job situation was resolved. Groceries still needed to be bought, and the emails that once came with assignments and deadlines were replaced with automated responses and polite delays that carried no real commitment. I took freelance editing work from contacts I had not spoken to in months, accepted rates I would have refused before, and learned quickly how fragile financial independence can feel when the structure supporting it disappears without warning. Some days passed in a blur of practical tasks, invoices, grocery lists, job applications, the kind of routines that keep a life moving even when its direction is uncertain, but other days stretched out in ways that forced me to sit with thoughts I could not distract myself from. I would find myself standing in the middle of my kitchen, holding a cup of coffee I had forgotten to drink, replaying fragments of the past not as isolated memories, but as part of a pattern I was only now beginning to understand fully. The question was no longer whether I had been treated differently, but how much of my life had been shaped by something I had never been allowed to name. There were moments when the temptation to go back, not physically, but emotionally, became stronger than I expected. Because familiarity, even when it is painful, offers a kind of structure that uncertainty cannot immediately replace. I drafted messages to Mom that I never sent, imagined conversations where everything would be explained in a way that made sense without requiring confrontation, and for brief, dangerous seconds, I considered the possibility that silence might be easier than continuing forward alone. But every time that thought surfaced, it carried with it the same realization that had followed me out of the studio. Going back would not give me answers. It would only return me to a version of myself that had learned not to ask the questions. So I stayed where I was, even when it felt like standing still in a life that had lost its shape, even when the absence of certainty made every decision feel heavier than it should have been. And slowly, without any clear moment marking the change, I began to understand that independence does not always feel powerful when it begins. Sometimes it feels like this: unstable, quiet, and entirely yours. The first sign that my life was changing again did not arrive with an offer or a breakthrough, but with a rejection that forced me to see my own situation from a distance, because sometimes clarity comes from realizing exactly how replaceable you have become in the eyes of systems that once relied on you. I had applied for a mid-level editorial role at a digital network I used to collaborate with, a position I would have secured easily 6 months earlier. And when the rejection email arrived, it did not reference my qualifications or experience, only a vague note about recent public exposure and brand alignment concerns. I read the message twice, not because I did not understand it, but because I needed to confirm that the consequences of telling the truth had extended further than my family, further than my job, into a space where reputation could quietly outweigh reality. Instead of closing my laptop, I opened a new document. I did not start with a plan, or even a clear idea of what I was building, but with a single decision that felt less like ambition and more like necessity, because if my story had already been I was not going to let that happen again without resistance. I began writing everything I knew, not in fragments, not in defensive explanations, but in a structured, verifiable timeline that connected documents, dates, names, and actions into something that could not easily be dismissed as emotional distortion. The process was slower than I expected, not because the information was unclear, but because organizing it required me to confront each part of it again, this time without the protection of denial or distance. Days turned into weeks, and the document grew into something larger than I had intended. No longer just a personal record, but a foundation that could stand on its own without me having to constantly defend it. I cross-referenced legal language, consulted with a records specialist I had worked with years earlier, and verified every claim twice before allowing it to remain on the page, because I understood now that credibility was not given, it was built through precision. The more I worked, the more something inside me shifted, not in a dramatic way, but in a steady, almost quiet transition from reacting to shaping. At some point, without announcing it to anyone, I made the decision to publish, not through a network, not through a producer, but on a platform where the structure was simple and the audience could choose to engage without being guided toward a conclusion, because I no longer trusted curated narratives. even when they claimed to support me. I uploaded the first piece late at night, attaching the supporting documents in redacted form, outlining the timeline in a way that allowed readers to follow the logic without needing to believe me first, and then I closed my laptop without checking the response. The next morning, the numbers were small. A few hundred views, a handful of comments, most of them cautious, some skeptical, a few quietly supportive, and for a moment, I felt the familiar disappointment of effort not immediately translating into impact. But instead of pulling back, I continued, posting the next section, then the next, each one building on the last, each one adding detail, context, and verification until the story began to take on a weight that no single post could have carried alone. The shift did not happen overnight. But when it did, it was unmistakable. One article was shared by a legal blog that focused on sealed records and custodial disputes, not because of me, but because of the documentation, and from there, the audience widened in a way I had not anticipated. Journalists reached out, not with sympathy, but with questions. The kind of questions that signaled interest rather than judgment. And for the first time since the broadcast, I was not being framed as a problem to be managed, but as a source to be understood. My inbox changed. Where there had been silence or distance, there were now messages from people who had experienced variations of the same pattern. Different details, different families, but the same underlying structure of control, concealment, and redefinition. I read them carefully, not because I felt responsible for their stories, but because I recognized something in them that I had once believed was uniquely mine. It wasn't. And that realization did more than validate what I had uncovered. It expanded it. Financially, things began to stabilize in ways that felt earned rather than given, because opportunities that aligned with the work I was doing started to appear. Not immediately, but consistently enough to build something sustainable. I was invited to contribute to a long-form investigative series, then offered a contract that allowed me to continue documenting cases similar to mine, not as personal catharsis, but as structured reporting, the kind that required discipline, verification, and distance. For the first time, my work and my story were not in conflict. They were aligned. The bracelet remained on my desk throughout all of it, not as a reminder of what had been taken, but as a marker of where the truth had begun to surface, and sometimes I would find myself holding it without thinking, tracing the engraved letter with my thumb, as if it connected me to something I was still in the process of understanding. I did not feel triumphant, but I no longer felt unstable. And in the quiet space between those two states, I realized something that had taken years to form and only weeks to confirm. I was no longer building a life around their version of me. I was building one from my own. The request did not arrive as a conversation this time, but as a statement drafted through a law firm whose name I recognized from the documents I had already uncovered, and the language was precise in a way that removed any illusion of care, outlining material harm, defamation risk, and a demand that I immediately retract my publications and cease further dissemination of unverified claims. I read it standing in my kitchen with the morning light cutting across the counter, and for a brief second, I felt the old instinct return, the one that measured danger not by truth but by consequence. Because this was no longer just my family attempting to control me. It was structure, reputation, and legal pressure aligning in a way designed to make resistance feel irresponsible. My phone began ringing before I could finish the second page. First from an unknown number, then from a journalist, then from a colleague who had not spoken to me in weeks, all of them pulling toward the same center, the same question of whether I would hold or collapse under the weight of what was now clearly a public conflict. I did not answer any of them. Instead, I opened my laptop and watched the numbers on my publication climb faster than they had the day before. Shares multiplying, comments dividing into support and accusation, strangers dissecting details of my life, as if proximity to the story granted them authority over its meaning. One thread accused me of exploiting a family tragedy for attention. Another defended the documentation with legal citations I had not included. And somewhere in between, a clipped segment of Mom's original interview began circulating again, her voice repeating the same line over and over in different contexts. She was never ours, until it stopped sounding like a statement and started sounding like evidence. That was when Dad called. His name appeared on my screen with a familiarity that carried decades of conditioning, and I let it ring longer than I ever had before, not because I was unsure, but because I needed to feel the space between who I had been and who I was choosing to be now. When I answered, his voice did not begin with anger or even urgency, but with a controlled restraint that was somehow more threatening than either. "You need to take it down," he said, without greeting, without context, as if the authority to decide that still belonged to him. "I'm not taking anything down," I replied, keeping my tone even, because escalation would only give him ground to reposition the conversation. And I could already hear the shift in his breathing. The small change that meant patience was about to give way to pressure. "You don't understand the damage this is causing," he continued, the words measured, but tightening with each sentence. "This is not just about you anymore. This affects the entire family, our name, our business, relationships you don't even see." The phrasing expanded the stakes deliberately, pulling the issue outward until my refusal could be framed as selfish rather than necessary. "It has always affected more than me," I said, and the sentence came without hesitation, because the truth no longer required careful introduction. There was a pause, shorter than before but heavier. "Then fix it," he said. And this time the restraint dropped. Not completely, but enough to reveal what had always been underneath it: expectation. "Issue a correction. Clarify that there are complexities you misunderstood. We can manage the rest. But you need to stop this before it escalates further." Manage the rest. The phrase settled into me with a clarity that cut through everything else, because it contained the entire pattern in 3 words. The same pattern that had shaped my life. Minimize. Contain. Rewrite. "I'm not correcting something that is documented," I said, my voice still steady, but no longer accommodating. And I could feel the shift on the other end of the line, the moment he understood that this was no longer a negotiation. "You're destroying your own family," he said. And the sentence came sharper now. Less controlled, because control depends on compliance, and compliance was no longer part of the structure. "No," I answered. And this time I allowed the word to stand on its own before continuing. "I'm refusing to protect a version of it that was built on hiding the truth." He did not respond immediately. Instead, another voice entered the call. "Mom, Eliana," she said, and her tone was not the composed warmth she had used on television, but something colder, more direct, stripped of performance now that the audience was gone. "You've made your point, and whatever you think you've uncovered, it does not justify what you're doing right now." "What I'm doing," I replied, "is making sure it doesn't disappear again." "You are not thinking clearly," she said, and the words came faster now, less structured, the control slipping as the situation moved further outside her reach. "There are things you don't understand. Agreements that were made long before you were old enough to be involved. And by pushing this publicly, you are putting yourself in a position you cannot recover from." The warning landed differently than it would have before. Not because it was less serious, but because I could finally hear it for what it was. Not protection, but containment. "I'm already in that position," I said quietly. And the sentence did not need emphasis because its meaning was already clear. "You think people will support you?" she continued, ignoring my response, pushing forward as if volume could replace control. "But they will turn. They always do. And when they do, you will not have this family to come back to." The words hung between us, not as a threat, but as a condition. "Come back. But only if you comply." For a brief moment, I felt the weight of that offer, not because it tempted me, but because it revealed exactly what had always been required of me to belong. Silence. Agreement. Erasure. "You're asking me to choose between the truth and this family," I said, and for the first time, I let the emotional layer of the sentence surface without losing control of it, because naming the choice mattered more than softening it. "I'm asking you to stop before you lose everything," she replied, and the certainty in her voice returned, not because she had regained control, but because she believed the outcome was inevitable. I looked at the bracelet on my desk, the small, constant reminder that something had existed outside of their version of my life, long before I had the language to question it. And I understood with a clarity that did not waver that the everything she was referring to had never fully included me in the first place. "I'm not losing everything," I said, my voice steady again, grounded in something that no longer depended on their approval. "I'm losing the version of it that was never real." Neither of them spoke, and for the first time, the silence on the line did not feel like something I needed to fill. It felt like something they could no longer control. The next time they tried to reach me, it was no longer framed as urgency or concern, but as an opportunity, a carefully arranged meeting proposed through Victor, who explained in a measured tone that my parents were prepared to resolve this privately if I agreed to sit down with them before the situation escalated further. I read his message twice, not because I needed clarity, but because I recognized the shift in language, from pressure to negotiation, from demand to offer, and I understood that this was not about resolution, it was about containment dressed as compromise. For a moment, I considered declining entirely. Not out of fear, but because I no longer needed anything from them. Not explanation, not acknowledgement, not even closure in the way I had once imagined it. But I agreed to meet them. Not to repair anything, to end it. The room they chose was a private conference space in a downtown office building. Neutral, impersonal, designed to keep conversations controlled and voices contained. And when I walked in, they were already seated across from each other, not side by side as a united front, but positioned in a way that suggested quiet disagreement beneath the surface. Mom looked composed again, but the effort was visible now, the precision slightly strained, while Dad's posture was more rigid than I had ever seen it, as if control, once lost, had to be held more tightly to feel real. "Eliana," Mom said, her voice softer this time, not warm, but measured in a way that suggested she had adjusted her approach, and for a brief second, I could see the version of this conversation she had rehearsed, one where calmness would be mistaken for sincerity. "I'm not here for a conversation," I replied, taking my seat without waiting for invitation, because the rules that once governed how I entered their space no longer applied. "I'm here so we don't have to do this again." Dad exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but heavier than usual, and leaned forward just enough to signal engagement without surrender. "This has gone far enough," he said, his voice returning to the familiar tone of authority, but lacking the certainty it once carried. "You've made your point, and now it's time to think about consequences beyond yourself." The phrasing was almost identical to what he had said before, but this time it did not land the same way, because I no longer interpreted it as guidance. I heard it as limitation. "You mean consequences for you," I said. Not sharply, but clearly enough to remove the ambiguity he depended on. And the silence that followed confirmed what none of them had said directly. Mom stepped in before he could respond. Her voice controlled, but with a different edge now. Less performative, more urgent. "We are offering you a way to move forward without damaging everything," she said, placing a folder on the table and sliding it toward me. The gesture deliberate, the implication unmistakable. A formal statement, mutual agreement, and a restructuring of what's been presented publicly, so that everyone can step back from this without further harm. I looked down at the folder but did not open it, because I already understood what it contained without needing to read it. Language designed to dilute, redirect, and neutralize what had already been established. "I'm not signing anything," I said, my voice even. Not resistant, not defensive, simply final. Dad's jaw tightened, the reaction small but visible, and for the first time, the restraint he had maintained began to fracture. "You don't get to decide that unilaterally," he said, the authority returning in tone if not in effect. "This involves legal matters you don't fully understand, and continuing down this path will not end the way you think it will." "I understand it better than you think," I replied, and the sentence carried no escalation, only certainty, because I had already considered every version of this outcome before I ever walked into the room. Mom leaned forward, her composure thinning further, the patience replaced by something sharper, closer to frustration. "What exactly do you want?" she asked. And the question, simple as it sounded, revealed something she had never allowed before: uncertainty. I met her gaze without hesitation. "Nothing," I said. And the words settled into the space between us with more weight than any demand could have carried. She blinked, not expecting that answer, not prepared for a position that did not require negotiation. "That's not realistic," she replied quickly, trying to reframe the moment into something she could work with. "Everyone wants something in situations like this. Resolution, acknowledgement, correction. You don't walk away from something like this with nothing." "I'm not walking away with nothing," I said. And for the first time, I allowed a slight shift in tone. Not softer, but clearer, more grounded. "I'm walking away without you deciding what I'm allowed to know, what I'm allowed to say, or who I'm allowed to be." The room went still again, but this time it was not tension. It was distance. Dad sat back slowly, the movement controlled but heavier than before. And whatever argument he had prepared did not come, because it depended on a version of me that was no longer present. Mom's expression changed again. Not into anger, not fully, but into something quieter, something that looked less like control and more like recognition of a boundary she could not move. "You're making a mistake," she said. But the words no longer carried authority, only insistence. "No," I answered. And this time the word did not need anything else to support it. Because for the first time in my life, I was not responding to them. I was deciding. And that decision did not require their approval. The day I stopped checking my phone for their names was not marked by a decision, but by the quiet absence of expectation, the kind that settles in when something you once depended on no longer defines your sense of direction. I still received messages for a while. Some indirect, some routed through people who believed they were helping, others framed as updates I was supposed to care about, but none of them carried the same weight they once had. Because distance had finally done what confrontation never could. It removed the illusion that resolution required their participation. My life did not suddenly become easier, nor did it resolve into something clean or predictable. But it became mine in a way it had never been before, shaped by choices that did not need to be approved, softened, or explained away. Work stabilized into something steady rather than uncertain. The investigative series expanded into a long-term project, and I found myself building routines that were not reactions to pressure, but reflections of intention, even if those routines were sometimes quiet enough to feel unfamiliar. There were still moments when the past surfaced without warning, in small, ordinary ways. A phrase, a memory, a detail that used to carry more meaning than it deserved, but those moments no longer redirected me. They passed through without altering the path I had already chosen. The bracelet remained on my desk, not as a symbol of loss, but as a marker of origin. Something that reminded me that truth can exist long before it is understood, and that understanding, once reached, does not require permission to remain. I eventually met Thomas Vale, not as a dramatic reunion, not as a replacement for anything I had lost, but as a conversation that filled in spaces I had lived with for years without naming. And although it did not change the life I had already built, it gave context to parts of it that had once felt incomplete. We spoke about Naomi, about the circumstances surrounding my birth, about choices made under pressure and opportunities taken by people who had more power than they admitted, and for the first time, the story of how I came into the world existed outside the version I had been given growing up. It was not simple, and it was not entirely fair, but it was real, and that reality mattered more than any version that had been constructed to protect someone else's comfort. I did not return to Fairfield, not because I needed to prove anything, but because I no longer needed to revisit a place that had defined me without ever fully seeing me. And the absence of that return was not an act of resistance. It was a reflection of completion. There were no final conversations, no reconciliations shaped for closure, no moment where everything aligned into something that resembled the endings people expect when stories resolve. And that absence, which would have once felt unfinished, now felt accurate. Because the truth is, not every relationship is meant to be repaired. Some are meant to be understood, and then left behind. I learned that independence is not loud. It does not announce itself or demand recognition. It builds slowly in the space where approval used to be required, until one day you realize that the need for that approval has disappeared, without asking for permission. I no longer measured my value by how I was seen within that family, or how I was described when I was not in the room, because the version of me that depended on those things no longer existed in a way that could influence my choices. And in the quiet that followed, I understood something that had taken my entire life to reach. Something that did not arrive as a revelation, but as a steady, undeniable truth. I no longer needed my family to define my worth.